In Potosi, Bolivia in 1968, one of the most famous alien encounters in the country's history would occur. The story concerns a young woman witnessing a strange entity mutilating her sheep and ultimately having an altercation with the bizarre being. The case truly stands out as a mild-mannered peasant brawled with an extraterrestrial. There's not many cases of humans fighting with aliens, as often witnesses are terrified beyond belief and choose to flee. For this young woman, though, when her fight-or-flight response kicked in, she clearly chose to fight. Despite this, even 30 years after the event, when interviewed, the woman was still terrified of what happened to her that day. In this episode, we will examine this strange and classic Bolivian story, a case that came to be known as the Potosi Sheep Slayer. Just outside Opoco, Bolivia, in the late 1960s, Valentina Flores, then 24 years old, and her husband, Gumercindo, were living a humble lifestyle. The two Quechua Indians were focused on tending to their livestock and raising their infant child, Theodosia. The two lived an isolated life with little contact with the outside world. As such, the two had no familiarity nor interest with extraterrestrials and UFOs, and were focused on making a living with their livestock. Sometime after Easter in 1968, Valentina would have an experience she would never forget. That day, her husband, Gumercindo, like all the men in the area, had been mandated to go to Las Pampas. Valentina was alone, along with Theodosia. Around 4 p.m., Valentina, with Theodosia strapped to her back in a manta, began herding her flock of sheep, only to discover some llama were missing. She herded the sheep into a grazing field and then went listening for the missing llamas. Valentina began tracking them, and after around 45 minutes, caught up with them. She started directing them back to the grazing field, but when she arrived, the sheep had ran off. She left the llamas behind and soon tracked the sheep to a stone corral. From a distance, she couldn't make out many details yet, but she was perplexed as to why they went in there. Even more strange, it was quiet, very quiet. As Valentina approached, what she saw next would leave her stunned. There was some sort of web-like transparent covering over the corral. She couldn't see everything inside it though, and soon silently crept up to see what was going on. As she looked through the opening in the corral, Valentina would be stunned to see sheep corpses everywhere. They were disemboweled and slaughtered in a horrifying fashion. Even worse, there was something inside the corral murdering them. The being was around 3 to 4 feet tall, and butchering the sheep with some sort of device with a razor-sharp hook. It appeared to be attached to a chain. The being was on one knee at this time, and was wearing strange clothing like a wetsuit. It had brown boots, red straps that covered the chest in an X shape, and appeared to support some type of backpack. It was wearing a helmet with a propeller on top. Valentina could see its face. The being had white, pale skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, and a bright red mustache. Valentina was furious when she saw the entity killing her sheep and lambs. This was her family's livelihood. She began throwing rocks at the entity and yelling at it. The being then stood up in shock and jumped over to a strange device. He started winding it, and the elastic webbing rolled into the device. At this point, Valentina would spot a second entity inside the corral. The second being ran out and then up a hill on the outside. The entity sat on some sort of chair, and then it soon took off into the sky. Valentina, furious at this point, was then left with just the one being. She walked in the corral surrounded by sheep's corpses and walked toward the creature. The being began talking to Valentina in an unknown language, but Valentina wasn't interested. Furious, she grabbed her club and struck it right in the head. blood spattered, and the entity screamed. The entity at this point began to realize it needed to defend itself. It grabbed the hooked object it used for slaughtering the sheep and threw it at Valentina's chest. The sharp blade landed right into her manta's thick knot, effectively saving her life. A chain then pulled the blade back to the being, and a fearless Valentina refused to back down. She ran at the entity and hit it in the arm with her stick. Once again it bled, but this time it decided not to strike back. It grabbed the mechanical box and ran off, soon disappearing into the sky. Valentina would notify her husband soon, and the local officials. Soon after that, the Bolivian army arrived and began investigating. There were sheep carcasses everywhere, at least 60. The bodies were missing internal and external organs, and even more strange, most or all of the blood appeared to be drained from many of the corpses. Although there is no proof, there is a belief that the Bolivian government collected the alien blood at the scene, and somewhere this blood is still stored. The Bolivian military would canvass the area and soon question other ranchers and farmers in the region. They would soon learn that during this time, many ranchers had experienced strange activity. For example, several stated they had found mutilated corpses drained of the blood and also seen odd beings running out of the corrals. Due to their livelihood gone, Valentina and her family would be forced to move south. In 2001, UFO investigator J.J. Benitez traveled to Bolivia to interview Valentina. She would relay the story to him. Perhaps the most interesting detail of the case was that Valentina was unfamiliar with extraterrestrials and UFOs. Although frightened, she didn't seem to make the connection. What can we make of this case? It's odd to say the least, and there are several things that seem to support it. One is that it doesn't appear the witness was fabricating the story. By all accounts, she seems to be credible. Also, there are questions as to why she would do this. For example, why would she slaughter 60 of her sheep and her family's livelihood? In addition, many others reported strange similar activity at the time of the incident, and it was investigated by the military. It appears to be such a strange story, it almost feels like this one couldn't be made up. Despite this, many critics say the case is flimsy. There was only one eyewitness, and some question whether a peasant woman carrying a newborn would viciously attack an unknown creature, especially one with a weapon. Could it be the case the family needed to abandon their lives for some reason? We know it couldn't be to collect an insurance payout, as no one, or the majority of ranchers, didn't have insurance back then for their livestock. Her motivation doesn't appear to be financial in any way. Still, perhaps Valentina was tired of the secluded life and just wanted to leave the isolation. This raises the question around the internal and external organs. Would she really have had the time to butcher 60 sheep and also remove all the organs? It seems far-fetched to think she would do this. One thing this case has going for it, though, is the livestock mutilations. Mutilations are still reported today and are quite common. Often strange activity occurs before and after them. There's cases of cows and other livestock being abducted, and even reports of abductees seeing them on crafts. While we may never know the truth about this event, this case has become quite popular, not only in Bolivia, but around the world.